Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. First of all, I hope everyone's healthy. I hope your loved ones, your family are doing well, and you're navigating this ongoing pandemic. I'm joined by a couple of guys here today. First of all, we have Austin Smith. Austin's only been with us a little more than a couple of months. He's doing a great job for us. I know a number of you have already spoken with him. Austin, a little more than 5 years in the industry. Sound about right? Okay. So just another resource for you in addition to Steve and I. So feel free that if we're not available, he's very capable of handling any questions or concerns you may have. And of course, Steve has been with me for a number of years now, and he's going to introduce our speaker today. So I'll be back to him in a second. So certainly this pandemic's been tough on everyone, but I would say to you that events like this, Zoom technology in general, is probably one of the positives. I think there's a few others that have come out of the pandemic. And although it existed prior to this, at least from our standpoint, we really weren't utilizing it that much. And to bring events like this to you, I've been able to use it. Steve's been able to use it just for individual client meetings, which has been great because we've got a number of you who are not in this local area. So it gives an opportunity to see you, number one, and secondly, to kind of share information with you on the screen. So again, I would say that that's one of the positives that's come out of this. Anybody who's been with us for any length of time knows that we typically do 2 in-person client events per year. We do a client appreciation event, and we typically try to do 1 educational event. Well, unfortunately, last couple of years, we've had to cancel that client appreciation event. And in lieu of that, we did make some nice charitable donations to a couple of local charities that got hit pretty hard by COVID. We're keeping our fingers crossed. We do have an event scheduled for June. I think June 2nd is the date. We're hopeful that by then, life will be closer to back to normal. And we'd love to see a lot of you there. The purpose of that event, I think, as you know, is just for us to say thank you for your business. Thank you for your loyalty. And it's just a fun evening. So again, hope to see you in June. Be on the lookout for that invitation. Educational events, we at most would do 1 a year. And this is our 4th virtual event in the last 18 months. So again, we see that as a real positive. Our thinking is we'll probably continue these in the future, not on any set schedule per se, but whenever we have what we think is a really good topic, something that would be of great interest to you, or a great speaker. We think we have both tonight, and we think that you're going to enjoy this. I hope you're going to enjoy this, but the subject matter that Morgan, our speaker, is going to talk about tonight is kind of near and dear to our heart. It's kind of the behavioral finance arena, if you will. And so again, the fact that we're able to bring this to you, I think Morgan is based in Seattle, so a lot easier to have an event like that with a speaker from Seattle through Zoom technology versus trying to have him trek across the country. So I'm not sure if he's in the comfort of his own home or at his office, but again, a lot easier to bring this event to you as a result of that. So Steve came to me a little while ago and said, I really think we should have Morgan speak to our clients. I think he's got a great message. So it's a strong recommendation from him because Steve has heard him speak. I've never heard Morgan speak, so I'm looking forward to tonight as well. But I'm going to let Steve take it from here and introduce Morgan to you. So, Steve.
Thanks, Len. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess I'll start with how it started. As Len mentioned, I've been following Morgan for a few years now, whether it be his blogs or listen to him on the radio. It could be the Motley Fool or whatever it may be. And one thing that always impressed me was his ability to get across valuable financial lessons using real world non-financial stories per se. And Morgan will talk about that in just a little bit here. So that said, every now and then we have a client that will reach out to us and say, hey, Steve, what financial book do you recommend? Whether it's for me or let's say a child of mine. And the first book that I think about is The Psychology of Money by Morgan. I think that it's probably the most complete book, I would say, in terms of giving you a better understanding of how your brain works and how it reacts to money. And whether you're a financial advisor with 30+ years, you're a financial advisor with 5 years, or you're a client of ours that might have 1 to 30 years of experience, like I said, I think it's the most well-versed and complete book in speaking to all of us. So a little bit about Morgan, his background here. So Morgan is the partner at the Collaborative Fund and a former columnist at the Motley Fool and the Wall Street Journal. He is a 2-time winner of the Best Business Award from the Society of American Business Editors and Writers, winner of the New York Times Sidney Award, and a 2-time finalist for the Gerald Loeb Award for Distinguished Business and Financial Journalism. His book, The Psychology of Money, is a New York Times bestseller, and as of, I believe, yesterday, has just surpassed 1 million copies after being released only 16 months ago. Morgan has presented at more than 100 conferences in a dozen countries. He speaks about behavioral finance and history, using storytelling to explore how investors deal with risk and how we can think about risk in a more productive way. That said, welcome, Morgan.
Thanks so much. It's an honor to be here. As everyone said, if we can't be together in person, at least we can still do this. So thank you again for having me. I'm going to share my screen here because I have some slides to share with you. So bear with me one moment here while I get this set up here. There we are. And what I want to talk to you about today is, of course, the psychology of money, which means I'm not going to tell you where the market is going to go next or where the economy might be going next, nothing like that. What I want to do is start with some comments about financial history, and particularly the question of why don't we learn from it, which is exactly what we do. Investors are making the same mistakes today that they were making 50 years ago, 100 years from ago. Why don't we learn from history? And there can be a lot of answers to that question. The most powerful being a lot of investors, even professional investors, are just kind of oblivious to investing history, despite all that data and stories being out there. They're just not paying that much attention to it. But there's another little explanation here, another little quirk here that I think is so important. There's a great quote from Voltaire who says, "History never repeats itself, but man always does." History never repeats, but man always does. And I think that kind of sums up the problem that we have when studying investing history. Most investing history that we look at is concerned with the specific events. How did Microsoft grow to be what it is? Why did the Great Depression happen? How did Silicon Valley grow to the prominence that it has today? That's what most investing history focuses on. But the problem with that is that even though it's interesting, those specific events, the details of those specific events will never repeat themselves. History never repeats itself. There will be other Microsofts, but it's never going to have the same origin story as Microsoft did. And there's going to be more Silicon Valleys, but it will never kind of grow to become what it does in the same way that Silicon Valley does. It's always a little bit different over time. But man always repeats itself. So the specific behaviors about how investors deal with greed and fear and opportunity and overconfidence, those kind of those things are timeless. Those are just indelible features about how people behave with their money. And people do the same things today that they were doing 100 years ago and that they will be doing 100 years from now. And I think that is where you can really learn a lot from investing history. Not the specific details of what happened, but the really broad, high-level behaviors that keep repeating again and again. I've always believed that investing is not really the study of finance, or at least that's just a small part of it. Investing is really the study of how people behave with money. And since it's a really broad topic like behavior, there are so many things that we can learn from other fields that teach us how people think about greed and fear and risk, which is all that investing is. So what I want to do with you now for the rest of this time here is share with you 4 stories, as Steve mentioned, none of which have anything to do with investing. But all of them, hopefully you will see, have a pretty clear takeaway about how we as investors can think about risk and greed and opportunity in a different and hopefully better way. So the first story I want to share with you today is that timing is meaningless, but time is everything. And like I said, this story has nothing to do with investing. I want to tell you a story about this moment right here. And most of you will recognize what this is. This is the first second of the first flight in human history. December 17th, 1903. This is the Wright brothers and Kitty Hawk, of course. And it's hard to overstate how big a deal this moment was because the airplane went on to change everything in the world. It completely revolutionized not just transportation, but communication and commerce and geopolitics. The airplane started world wars, it ended world wars. Like nothing was the same after this came into use. And the really cool thing about this moment is that you don't need any scientific understanding to grasp how big a deal this is. This is not like mapping the genome where you need to be a scientist to even understand what it means. This is just a guy flying through the sky like a bird for the first time. And so even if you were a child watching this, you understood how big a deal this was. And so you can imagine how exciting this moment was for the world and how journalists all over the world were writing stories about how the world was changed forever now that humans could fly in an airplane. Except that's actually not at all what actually happened next. This I want to show you is the front page of the New York Times on December 17th, 1903, the day of the Wright brothers' first flight. And it's tiny print there, but you can take my word for it. There is no mention of the Wright brothers in there anywhere at all. This is the next day, December 18th, no mention at all. And the 19th, and the 20th, and the 21st, and the 22nd. There's no mention anywhere in there about what the Wright brothers were doing. By this time, they had flown over a dozen times. And the largest newspaper in the country, there's no mention anywhere about what they were doing. And this went on for weeks. It went on for months. It went on for years, in fact. 2 years after the Wright brothers first flew, the New York Times did an interview with a German hot air balloon tycoon, as you can see here. And they asked this hot air balloon tycoon if humans would ever fly in an airplane, because a lot of people were trying back then. A lot of people wanted to do it. And when they asked him, what he said was, quote, "In the very, 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 very far future, there may be flying machines, but not now, not now." Again, that is 2 years after the Wright brothers' first flight, and the largest newspaper in the country did not even know that they had done it yet. One of the most incredible things about the Wright brothers' first flight is that after they invented the airplane and were successful at flying it, almost nobody paid attention. No one cared about what they were doing at the time. There was, in fact, one newspaper that covered the Wright brothers' first flight. It was the Dayton Herald. The Wright brothers are from Dayton, Ohio. And this is how they covered it at the time. And I love how it's framed like this, like just a bunch of silly kids that did a science experiment that didn't really have any meaning in the world, didn't mean anything. The editor of this newspaper is a guy named Luther Beard. And Luther Beard was asked many years later why he was the only journalist to cover the Wright brothers' first flight. And what he said was, quote, "I used to chat with them, the Wright brothers, in a friendly way because I sort of felt sorry for them. They seemed like well-meaning, decent enough young men, yet there they were, wasting their time day after day on that ridiculous flying machine." So the only journalist to cover the Wright brothers' first flight did it out of sympathy for these poor kids. Now, after Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers went back to Dayton, Ohio, where they're from. And Dayton is really where they mastered flying. They figured out the two most difficult parts, which are turning and landing. And Dayton was a very populated city during this time, and they were flying like through the middle of Main Street and over people's homes. David McCullough wrote a great biography of the Wright brothers, and he talks about this period back in Dayton. He writes, quote, "Not one reporter bothered to attend during this time, nor did public interest increase. With few exceptions, there seemed to be no public interest at all, no local excitement or curiosity or sense of wonder over the miraculous thing happening right in Dayton's own backyard." Now, of course, in due time, the Wright brothers got the credit. They got the recognition that they deserved, of course, but it took years. It took them about 5 years to build the airplane and then another 5 years before anyone paid any attention to it and thought it was worth paying attention to. And this is so important because if you think about the traits of successful entrepreneurs, people think about things like creativity and ingenuity, your engineering ability, maybe your marketability, things like that. Rarely do you think about patience and time horizon as a competitive advantage. Or to the extent that we do think about patience as a competitive advantage, we usually massively underestimate how much time is needed to put the odds of success or the odds of recognition in this case in our favor. And that, of course, is also true in investing. And I'll show you what I mean. This is Warren Buffett's net worth over the course of his life, from age 14 when he had $5,000 in the bank till today when he is 90 years old, he's worth $100 billion. This is how it played out at various points in his life. And something that should stick out from this chart that I think is so astounding, no matter how many times I think about it, is that 99% of Warren Buffett's net worth was accumulated after his 50th birthday. And 97% came after his 60th birthday. That's just how compounding works. It's not something that takes place over 5 years or 10 years. It is a lifetime endeavor. And this is so important because we in the industry have spent so much time trying to answer the question, how did Warren Buffett do it? How did he become as successful as he is? And we go into all this detail about how he thinks about business models and stock market cycles and CEO teams, et cetera, which are all really important topics. Even if we know that literally 99% of his success is just tied to the amount of time that he's been investing for. Is he a good investor? Yes, of course he is. But the whole secret is that he's been a good investor for 80 years. That's what makes all the difference. Because if Warren Buffett had retired at age 60, like a normal person might, you would have never heard of him. If he started investing at age 30, like a normal person might, you would have never heard of him. What makes all the difference in the world is just how long he's been investing for. And that is so easy to overlook or discount how important it is. This is true for us ordinary investors as well. What this shows is going back to the 1870s. What is the maximum and the minimum annual returns that you could have earned in the stock market based on holding period? So if you held stocks for 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, what's the best you could have done annually and the worst you could have done annually? That's what this shows. And something that should stick out from this chart is that it is not until between 10 and 20 years that every holding period finishes with a positive return. Not a good return, not just not losing money. And this is so important because if you ask investors, are you a long-term investor? Most investors will tell you yes. Most investors think they are long-term investors. But then if you ask them, what does long-term mean? What is the definition of long-term? A lot of investors will tell you 1 year is the long-term. And you might laugh at that, but what is the IRS's definition of a long-term capital gain? It's 1 year. Some investors will tell you 3 years or 5 years. That's the long-term. 10 years definitely feels like the long run, especially if you are nearing or in retirement. Even if we know that historically a pretty good definition of long-term, the definition being just not losing money after inflation, is something between 10 and 20 years. So it's just so easy to underestimate how much time might be needed to put the odds of success in your favor. I think we have to remind ourselves as investors that when progress is measured generationally, results should not be measured quarterly. And the central problem that investors have in the stock market, the single biggest problem that they have by far, is just underestimating the amount of time that might be needed to put the odds of success in their favor. And it is such boring advice and basic advice that no one wants to hear. But the absolute truth is that there is nothing more important than exists in this industry than increasing the amount of time that you are investing for. It's boring and basic, but there is no stronger lever that exists in this industry. That's the first story we talked about today. The second story is that risk is what you don't see. And this too is a story that has nothing to do with investing. I want to tell you a story about this guy right here, Harry Houdini. Of course, the great magician who did most of his work about 100 years ago. And Houdini, of course, was known for his escapes. He would tie himself up in chains and throw himself in a river or wrap himself in a straitjacket and bury himself in dirt, whatever he would do, and he'd escape. He was the best in the world at this. This is what he became famous for. But Houdini had another trick that he played during every show that he was not famous for, but the audiences absolutely loved it. And what he would do is at the end of every show, Houdini would invite the strongest man from the audience onto stage, and he would tell that man to punch him in the stomach as hard as he could. Houdini's claim to fame was that he could flex his stomach in a way that he could absorb any man's punch. So the guy would stand there punching on him and Houdini wouldn't even flinch, and the audiences ate it up. They loved it. But one day after a show in 1922, Harry Houdini went back to his dressing room and he invited a group of college students back there to meet him. And one of the college students was a skinny little kid named Gordon Whitehead. And Gordon Whitehead walked up to Harry Houdini and he started punching him in the stomach as hard as he could. He didn't mean any harm. He wasn't trying to pick a fight or anything. He just thought he was performing the trick that he had just seen on stage. But Houdini was not prepared to be punched. He was not flexing his stomach. All of a sudden, he was doubled over in pain. He said, he told Gordon Whitehead that the trick only works if he's prepared for it and he's flexing his stomach. Gordon Whitehead apologized profusely, but Harry Houdini went to bed that night completely doubled over in pain. He woke up the next morning. He couldn't even get out of bed. He was in so much pain. His appendix had ruptured the night before, almost certainly from Gordon Whitehead's punch to the stomach. And Harry Houdini died later that day. This is how he died. And what I think is astounding about how Harry Houdini died is that he was like the world's foremost authority on surviving big risks. No one could survive a risk like he could. But the one thing that he could not survive, the one thing that killed him, is just a skinny little college student's punch to the stomach that he didn't see coming, that he was not prepared for. And what that shows is something that is so important in a lot of areas in life, which is that how risky something is depends on whether you are prepared for it. Not how big of a risk you think it is or how much damage you think it can cause, but just whether it's a surprise or not. That's what makes all the difference. And how starkly have we all learned that over the last year with COVID? that the biggest economic risk is what no one is talking about. Because if no one is talking about it, no one is prepared for it. And if no one is prepared for it, its damage is just amplified whenever it arrives. That to me is like the biggest lesson of COVID over the last 18 months. And I'll show you how this impacted the investing industry. For the better part of the last decade, we in the industry, as financial analysts and portfolio managers and pundits and journalists, spent most of our time trying to answer the question, what is the biggest economic risk? What's the biggest risk that faces us as investors that we should be paying attention to? And we tend to personify these investments, or these risks, I should say. So we asked over the last 10 years, was this guy the biggest risk? Was it Barack Obama? The tax hikes of 2013, was he the biggest risk to the economy? Was it this guy? Was it Ben Bernanke? All the money printing after the financial crisis, was he the biggest risk? Was it this guy? Was it Donald Trump? The trade wars in the last 4 years, was that the biggest risk? This is the debate that took up 90% of the oxygen in the industry. And the irony about this today is that looking back in hindsight, the answer to what is the biggest risk to the economy is none of these three guys. By far and away, by an order of magnitude, it was this guy. It was a virus that no one was talking about. It was not in any economic outlook, no analyst forecast until the moment it arrived and 20 million people lost their jobs in 6 weeks. By far and away, the biggest risk is what no one was talking about, no one was paying attention to. And I think if you look historically, that's always the case. This is always the case. The things that we talk about as investors are things like trade wars and next quarter's earnings and budget deficits and elections. That's what's in the newspaper all day long, that we read about all day long. And it's not that these things aren't risky. It's just that they're not surprises. Everyone's talking about them. Maybe you don't know who's going to win the election, but you know there's going to be an election. It's not a surprise to anyone. But if you look historically at like what actually makes a difference to investors in hindsight, what actually moves the needle, it's things like COVID-19. And Lehman Brothers couldn't find a buyer in 2008 that sparked the financial crisis. 9/11 and Pearl Harbor, that's what actually moves the needle, that makes a difference more than anything else that came before it. And the common denominator of all those events is not that they were big, it's that they were surprises. It's just that no one saw them coming until the moment that they had arrived and wreaked all their havoc. Carl Richards, who's a great financial advisor who I admire, he has a quote that I like. He says, "Risk is what is left over when you think you have thought of everything." That's the best definition of what risk is. It's just what we're not talking about. And that can be kind of disheartening to hear because it kind of makes you feel like you're a fatalist and just kind of crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. But I think there's two things to keep in mind to help you navigate risk in a world where risk is what we don't see. The first is understanding the difference between expectations and forecasts. They're two very different things. If I were to say, hypothetically, the next recession will occur in June of 2023, I'm just making that up. That's a forecast. That's a specific forecast. But if I were to say, historically, there are on average 2 recessions per decade, and I expect that to be the case going forward. I don't know when they're going to occur or what's going to cause them, but 2 recessions per decade, that's my baseline expectation. That's very different from a forecast. And I think that's the best way that we can think about risk in this world, rather than a specific forecast, just having really high level expectations about these bad events that might occur at any given moment. We don't know what's going to cause them. The second thing to keep in mind is understanding the difference between getting rich and staying rich. They are 2 completely different skills that kind of need to be nurtured on their own. Getting rich requires being an optimist, being optimistic about the future of the country and your own abilities, swinging for the fences, taking a risk. That's what you need to get rich. Staying rich requires almost the exact opposite. It requires a degree of pessimism and conservatism, and just an acknowledgement that all of history is a constant chain of surprises and setbacks and recessions and bear markets and pandemics that you need to be able to survive and endure financially so that your long-term optimism actually has a chance of working. Charlie Munger has a great quote that I think summarizes this well. He says, "The first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily." If you want to compound over time, you need to have enough pessimism and conservatism in your investments so that you can survive and endure long enough for that long-term compounding to actually work. So that's the second story to share with you today. The third story is that you can be wrong half the time and still do great. And this too is a story that has nothing to do with investing. I'll tell you a story about baby brain development. And if you have children, you know that the amount of growth that takes place inside of a newborn child's brain is just extraordinary. How much they learn in their first couple of years in life is just astounding to watch. The average child is born with about 100 billion brain neurons. And each one of those neurons has about 3,000 synaptic connections, which are these connections to other neurons that forms this web of intelligence inside your brain. Maybe when your baby is born, this web looks something like this. At age 6 months, that has increased from 3,000 to 6,000 synaptic connections. So a tremendous amount of growth that's just increasing this web of knowledge inside of your brain. By 2 years, that's increased from 6,000 to 10,000 synaptic connections. So just an exponential amount of growth that takes place in the first 2 years. And then after 2 years, something very interesting happens, which is that the number of synaptic connections in your brain, this web of knowledge in your brain, not only peaks and plateaus, but it starts to decline. And it starts to decline fairly rapidly. By age 4, the average child has lost 1/5 of the synaptic connections in their brain that they had at age 2. By age 6, they've lost about 1/3 of the connections, the density of knowledge in their brain that they had at age 2. And this continues all throughout childhood, into your adolescence, into your early adult years. By the time the average person is 25 years old, they have lost half of the synaptic connection density that they had at age 2. Why does this happen? Well, it turns out that a lot of the learning that takes place in the early years of your life, where you're building these connections, are connections that are redundant, that are not very efficient. It's learning that is not very relevant to the new world. Sometimes these connections are learning that's just completely miswired. There's some evidence, particularly in the first few moments of a child's life, that some babies can hear colors and smell sounds because a part of their brain that is processing that information is just completely miswired. And so you go through a lot of your early years in life shedding and getting rid of these inefficient, redundant, unnecessary connections in your brain. But what's really important about this is that even though what's going on inside of your head is loss and destruction, you're still getting smarter. Like a 4-year-old is much smarter than a 2-year-old. And a 25-year-old is much smarter than a 4-year-old. Most of the time, at least. We have all met exceptions, of course. But this idea that something can improve and get better over time, even though what's going on inside is loss and destruction, is not very intuitive. You can imagine if you were a parent and you could see inside your child's brain every day and see that they had fewer connections than they did the day before, you would panic. You would say, this is wrong, this can't be right, something's broken, I need to see a doctor, even if what's going on is the normal path of growth. The idea that something can improve, even though what's going on inside is loss, is not very intuitive, but we see it in a lot of fields. And one of the fields we see it very often in is in investing. I'll show you what I mean. This is the Russell 3000 index, just an index of 3,000 large companies in the United States going back to 1980. And this is almost like the picture of success for a large nation's stock market. Average annual returns of about 12% per year. This is like as good as it gets for a large nation's stock market. If we can repeat this over the next 40 years, it's as good as anyone can hope for. But if you look at what went on inside of the index during this period and how these 3,000 individual companies actually performed in the index, you get a completely different view. You will see that the median stock out of these 3,000 companies underperformed the average by 54 percentage points. 40% of the components in this index lost money over this 40-year period. The vast majority of those lost all of their value, not because they were bought by another company or merged, but because they went bankrupt. 40% of the companies in this index went out of business. Virtually all of the gain comes from 7% of components that had extraordinarily high returns. So here too, you start with something that's done very well over time, has improved a lot over time. But then you look at what went on inside of the index, and it's a constant chain of chaos and loss and destruction. And this is true for how we think about volatility as investors as well. This is the S&P 500 going back to its inception in 1957. And this again is like the picture of success. The stock market increased 200-fold during this period. That is an amazing return that occurred during this period. We're so lucky to have this kind of wealth accumulation engine at our disposal. But if you look at what went on inside of the index during this period, that too, you get a completely different view. This shows when the market was down 5% from its previous all-time high. That's when it's down 10% from the previous all-time high. And that's when it's down 20% or more from the previous all-time high. So you start with something that's done so well over time, but then you layer on the nuance of what actually happened, the details of what happened during this period, and you get a totally different view. It's a constant chain of loss and destruction. And what's so important about this is that at every one of the bars on this chart, you have investors all over the world, good investors, smart investors, educated investors, who think they've discovered for the first time like a stock market that doesn't work anymore, and so they sell. They think they've uncovered something really special about a broken stock market, even though what they are experiencing is just the normal path of very successful growth over time. And this is accentuated if we are talking about individual stocks, if you're a stock picker. This is Netflix stock from 2002 to 2018. I just grossly cherry picked in hindsight, what are the best returns that you can think of from a large cap company? You made 500 times your money during this period. This, with hindsight cherry picking, this is like as good as it gets. But these are the losses that you had to endure in percentage terms, the drawdowns from the previous all-time high to achieve those returns. And this is why the percentage of investors who can actually hold a stock like Netflix for these 16 years rounds to zero. It's just not intuitive to think that on your way to making 500 times your money, you're going to lose 70% of your money twice. You're going to lose half your money on 6 separate occasions. That's just not an intuitive thing to think about, even if that is the normal path of long-term growth over time. Someone once asked Napoleon, what is the definition of a military genius? And I loved his answer. He said, a military genius is the man who can do the average thing when everyone else around him is losing his mind. I think it's the exact same in investing. That good investing is not about making great decisions. It's about consistently not making mistakes. That's what actually makes the biggest difference. It's about consistently not screwing up, consistently not reacting to the chaos and the loss and the destruction of the short term that feels like a broken stock market, but is actually just the normal path of growth and the cost of admission that you need to be willing to pay to do well in the market over a long period of time. That's the third story. The last story for you today is that everyone has a different view of the world. And I want to start with this by showing you the fatality rates that took place in the United States and around the world during a bunch of well-known events. Hurricane Katrina killed about 1,800 Americans. Pearl Harbor was about 2,500 deaths. 9/11 was about 3,000 fatalities. Allied soldiers on D-Day, about 4,400. The next I want to show you is FEMA's baseline estimate for the number of fatalities that will take place during a rupture of the Cascadia subduction zone, which is a very specific kind of earthquake that takes place off the coast of Washington state. FEMA's baseline estimate is that in this event, 16,000 people would die in Seattle in one day. When most people think about earthquake risk in the United States, they focus overwhelmingly on 2 cities, San Francisco and Los Angeles. But it turns out any way you look at the numbers, Seattle, where I happen to live, is by far at the biggest risk. The similar numbers for a major earthquake in San Francisco and LA are between 3,000 and 5,000 deaths. Seattle is 16,000 and it's a smaller city. And a lot of the reason this number is so high is not just because Seattle's geography kind of puts it in the path of major earthquakes. That's part of it. But a lot of the reason this number is so high is that any way you look at it, Seattle is less prepared for a major earthquake than San Francisco or Los Angeles. California has had a pretty good earthquake building code since 1933. They passed many decades ago voter-approved bonds so that the owners of big buildings could take out low-interest loans so that they could retrofit their buildings to withstand a major earthquake. They did that decades ago. Washington State, by comparison, cannot even do a survey that maps out where the at-risk buildings are even located. And what Washington State has not really had a good building code, at least that had teeth until the 1990s. And keep going on down the list, the amount of earthquake-specific training that firefighters and EMS crews go through, much greater in California than it is in Washington. Signages for evacuation routes in hospitals and schools and shopping malls, way greater in California than it is in Washington. And what's interesting about this is that the people of Washington State have the same data as anyone else in California. They have access to the same seismologists. It's basically the same political climate. And people in Washington want to avoid catastrophe as much as anyone in California. But while Californians have moved mountains to prepare for the next major earthquake, people in Washington, by comparison, have done relatively nothing. Why is that? I think the best explanation is this. California has lots of small and medium-sized earthquakes. So if you live in California, you are constantly being reminded, and sometimes woken up at 3 in the morning with your chandelier shaking, reminded that earthquakes are an ever-present part of your life and you need to do something about it. Washington State, by comparison, does not have lots of small earthquakes. It has catastrophic earthquakes that occur every few hundred years. And because of that, if you live in Washington, you just do not have this constant reminder that earthquakes are a part of your life. So earthquakes are just not part of the culture in Washington like they are in California. And because of that, the people around here, I think, have done relatively little to prepare for it. And what that shows is something really important, which is that when people think about risk, they don't do it in an analytical way. You don't just take the data and put it into the formula and the formula tells you what to do and you go and do it. That's not how people actually think about risk in the real world. When people think about risk, they do it in a cultural way. And everything that you think is risky and your willingness to do something about it is heavily tied to where you were born and what generation you're from, just what you've happened to experience in your own life. And just this idea that we all become prisoners to what we happen to experience in our own life. And that is also true in investing. I'll show you what I mean. What this is about to show is what the stock market did in your teens and 20s, your young and impressionable teens and 20s, when you were learning a baseline foundation of knowledge that will likely stick with you for the rest of your life. If you were born in 1970, the market went up tenfold in your teens and 20s. That's adjusted for inflation, an amazing return that you earned early on in your life, experienced early on in your life. If you were born in 1950, by comparison, the market went nowhere in your teens and 20s, 0% return after inflation. I'll ask you, do you think these two generations went through the rest of their lives thinking the same thing about the stock market? Thinking that it had the same amount of risk embedded in it, or it was capable of producing the same returns? And the answer, as we'll see in a second, is no. This stuck with them forever. Not because one generation was smarter than one another, just because of the dumb luck of where and when they were born. This is true for something like inflation as well. If you came of age in the 1980s, inflation averaged about 8% per year. If you grew up in the 2000s, it was about 2% per year. If you grew up in the 1930s, it was a negative 1% per year during the Great Depression. And Venezuela in the last 3 years has had 1,000,000% inflation. You can't even put a bar, it just goes up half a mile into space. Look, I'd ask you again, do you think these generations went through the rest of their life thinking the same thing about inflation? And the answer is clearly no. And we saw this about a decade ago when gold as an investment became very popular after the financial crisis when the Fed was printing a lot of money. What generation was gold most appealing to during this period? It was not my generation because we've never experienced any meaningful inflation in our lives. It was the baby boomers who came of age in the 70s and 80s and do remember gas lines and 15% mortgage rates and high inflation, which is something that I can read about and try to empathize about, but I don't have the emotional scar tissue of someone who lived through it. And nothing is more persuasive than what you've experienced firsthand. And since we've all experienced something a little bit different, all of us think about risk in very different ways, even if we are just as smart and have the same information as one another. Several years ago, a group of researchers from Stanford crunched a bunch of data. They got a hold of about 100 years of brokerage account data, how people invest their money. And they wanted to answer a question, how does what we've experienced impact how we actually invest in real time? And what they showed was that if you grew up during the Great Depression, you were half as likely to invest in stocks compared to those who grew up in the 1960s. If you grew up during the 1970s when inflation was high, you were a third as likely to invest in bonds later in life compared to those who grew up in the 1950s. If you grew up in the 1980s, you are twice as likely to buy stocks compared to those who grew up in the 70s. And their big conclusion when they put all this together was, quote, our findings suggest that individual investors' willingness to bear risk depends on their personal history, not on their intelligence, not where they went to school, not how smart their financial advisor is, just where and when they happen to be born. Now, many years ago, I did an interview with Dr. Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman is a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work in behavioral finance. And he mentioned at one point how this impacts him personally. He mentioned at one point that he is the biggest pessimist he's ever met. He said, no one is more pessimistic on the outlook of humanity than he is. And I said, wow, that's so interesting. Is that because you have all this insight into how our thinking goes astray and how flawed we are about thinking about risk? And he said, no. He said, I'm a pessimist because I grew up in Nazi-occupied France. And he said, I saw from an early age how evil people could be. And that of course, that's not an experience that I had, but that was his life. That's what he learned early in life. And it shaped how he thought about risk for the rest of his life, including how he thought about financial risk. And that's an extreme example, but I think we all have something like that. That whenever we're thinking about risk, we just become prisoners to whatever we've experienced in life. And I think there's really only two things that you can do to kind of embrace this reality and try to get around this reality. One is talk to as many people as you can, particularly investors who are from a different generation or grew up in a different country than you did. Those are the investors who've had a very different experience than you as an investor. And just by talking to them about where they see the world going, what they're looking at, what they're worried about, what they're excited about, you're just kind of opening your mind to the range of possibilities that you might experience as an investor, trying to get outside of the little bubble that you and all of us live in. The other thing to keep in mind here is realize that people who make different financial decisions than you are not always crazy. I think there's a view in finance where we view it like math. And in math, there's one right answer for everyone. 2 + 2 = 4 for everyone, no matter where or when you were born, one right answer. And I just think there's so much evidence that investing is not like that. That since we all have different backgrounds, we're all going to have different risk tolerances, different aspirations, different goals in life. And therefore, we should not expect any two people, even who look a lot alike, have the same income, the same age, to want the same things and to invest their money the same way. And so much of what matters in investing is just becoming introspective about who you are and what your own personal risk tolerance is, what your own goals are, even if those things are completely different from other people around you. And so if there's a common denominator about these 4 stories today, it's that when people tend to think about risk and investing, they usually think about what's going to happen to them. What's the stock market going to do to me? What's the economy going to do to me? That's how we think about risk. I think a much better way to think about risk is just what we do to ourselves. It's our own biases, our own misconceptions, our own impatience, anchoring to our own little unique views of the world. That's what does the most damage to investors. And that's actually a pretty optimistic realization. Because of course, you have no control over what the stock market's going to do next. And you have no control over what the economy is going to do next. The only thing you can control as an investor is your own behavior. And when you realize that behavior is by far the single most critical aspect to good investing returns, that's actually pretty optimistic. So I will end with you today with a quote from an investor who I really admire, who says, people do not get what they want or what they expect from investing. They get what they deserve. It all just comes down to how you behave. I'm going to end my screen share right there, but I think we have some time now for some Q&A. But thank you again for having me. Thank you for listening. And I'd be happy to take any of your questions now.
Great. Morgan, thank you. I apologize, folks. I was supposed to say at the beginning that during the presentation, if you have questions, you could actually send an email to Mary Beth up front here. But we did have a few people who emailed in advance of the presentation. So Morgan, we are going to throw a few quick questions at you. Very quickly, Mary Beth's email address is mflagler, FLAGLER, @albanyfinancial.com. So if anybody has any questions and they want to very quickly send her an email, we'll do our best to get to it. But Steve, I think you got a couple in advance here, right?
Yeah, Morgan, I got 2 questions for you. Thanks again. The first one, just given everything that you've thrown out at us and the behavior and the psychology of finance, how often do you personally look at your own portfolio in a given day or week?
I love that question because the answer is once a day. That's the answer, which is a lot. But here's the thing. How often do I make actions to my portfolio? How often do I sell? Never. I buy pretty consistently. I buy twice a month. I never sell, but I check every day. I think rather than viewing, checking your portfolio as a flaw, what you really need to find as a flaw is the actions that you take. If I were checking it every day and buying and selling every day, that would be terrible. I check every day because I think it's interesting. I think it's exciting. I like watching it go up and down. I just think it's fun to watch, but I don't ever take any actions. So I think there are a lot of people who think, oh, because you're a long-term investor, that means I don't check it. And for some people, that's the right thing. I love watching markets. I think markets are fascinating. I love reading economic news. I love reading what the Dow did today because I think it's exciting. It's intellectually stimulating, but I don't take any action of it. So that's the nuanced answer to that.
Well, one final question here for you, Morgan. Was there any adverse or positive event in your life that led you to think the way you do about money?
I'll give you two answers here. One is kind of like from a generational perspective, and one is more personal. My generation, I graduated college in 2008, which is when the global economy was completely falling apart. That was my and many people's introduction into the global economy. Well, you graduated college, welcome. Here's a completely broken society for you to walk into. That was kind of the opening scene. And then my generation had a very tepid economic recovery in the 2010s. And then last March, everything completely fell apart again with COVID. I think that was really interesting. That having that as our whole adult life has been interesting because in 2008, it was easy for people to say, this is bad, but this is a fluke. This is a once in a lifetime event. This kind of thing doesn't happen very often. But then when COVID happened last year and 20 million people lost their jobs, then it was easy for that generation to say, this is just how the world works. Every 5 or 10 years, everything that you know breaks around you. And I think when that's all you've ever known, and you didn't grow up during the prosperous 1920s, 60s, 90s, whatever it was, if all you've ever known is kind of collapse and flatlining, I think that can leave a generation with the idea that the world breaks every 5 or 10 years, which is maybe an accurate view of the world. But I think it has the potential to leave a whole generation a little bit scarred. In a similar way that the generation who grew up during the Great Depression, and then once that was over, they got pushed into World War II. That generation is well documented, went through the rest of their life pretty conservative, just scarred, and just like had this view that tragedy was around the corner at all times. That's a generational perspective. From a personal perspective, when I was in college, I was a valet at a really nice hotel in Los Angeles. And that was my first introduction to very wealthy people who are coming in their Ferraris and their Lamborghinis and their Rolls Royces and whatnot. And I had never been exposed to that kind of wealth. I grew up in a middle-class family. I'd never seen that before. And I was, in my late teens, early 20s, my thought was, I want to be that guy. That's who I want to be. That's what I want to do. And what's interesting about that now that I'm in my late 30s is I look back at that and I'm like, that's completely antithetical to who I want to be now. And so that experience of like, I wanted to chase, I wanted to be I wanted to get rich so that I could be really flashy. That I think was a good experience because that once I started going down that path, I could see all the little flaws of it, of how people think about risk and wealth and how their social aspirations and whatnot. So I think that was a really defining moment for me, was seeing like a really extreme end of wealth in Los Angeles, aspiring to it, but then also seeing the flaws that came from it. And then kind of being to where I am right now of being like, I want to grow my net worth. I want money as much as anyone else, but I want it for safety and independence and autonomy and being able to control my time more than I want it for the Lamborghini like I once thought I did.
Good answer. So, you guys think of any other questions for Morgan? I feel like I could listen to him for a while here.
Yeah, we have, if you have some time, Morgan, we have,
Yeah.
Actually, we had a couple others come in. Have your spending habits changed now that you're a New York Times bestseller and 1 million copies sold?
No, not at all. The personal side of this is whenever I get a book check, I set aside some for taxes and I send the rest to Vanguard. That's honestly what I've done. So no, it really hasn't changed at all. I think my wife and I have we found a lifestyle that makes us happy, and we've clung to it, even though different circumstances have changed. I don't know if it'll ever change that much. I think we've done a pretty good job at like getting the goalpost to stop moving. Not a perfect job, but like a pretty good job of being like, this is how we like to live. And even if we could afford more, like we're totally happy here. And more to it than that is, like I said earlier, what I really want out of money is independence and autonomy. And that's when you're like, I just want to grow my net worth so that I can do whatever I want. I can wake up every day and just say, I can do whatever I want today. And that to me, more than spending on a day-to-day basis, is what I think money can give me and my family a lot of pleasure to do, is just having complete independence and autonomy to just only work on the stuff that I want to work on. and do the work that I want to do, not because I'm just like chasing the next paycheck, but because I actually enjoy doing it. That's what I want out of money and wealth. And that's why we've saved every penny and our spending hasn't changed much.
So I have a question for you. Are you prepared for an earthquake?
I like that too. The biggest risk in Seattle are the old high rises. That's what's at the biggest risk. And I think FEMA's estimate is that during this major earthquake, 1,000 large buildings in Washington state, which they define as over 4 stories, will collapse to the ground. Not just be damaged, but collapse, 1,000 of them. So if you are in a residential home or a new large building, then I think you're okay. But there's a number of older high rises that I think are pretty, when you dig into the research, it's astounding that we don't pay more attention to it, because it's like it's the most likely catastrophe outside of like freak events that will I think the best estimate from seismologists is of the odds that it will occur in the next 50 years are 1 in 10, which is kind of a lot. So it's astounding when you look into it, but I have a feeling, fingers crossed, that my family and I will be okay.
Good. Okay. All right. Morgan, we thank you so much. Hopefully you all enjoyed it as much as we did. So if you do think of any other questions, feel free to send them our way. We'll get them to you, Morgan, and we'll definitely get back to you with an answer. But other than that, best to you and your family, and to all of our clients, thanks for joining us. We look forward to talking to you all soon.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Okay, take care.